The clatter of silverware at the Gilded Lyre was the sound of old money digesting itself. It was a low, contented murmur, a symphony of polished silver against porcelain, underwritten by the hushed tones of men who measured their wealth not in dollars, but in generations. Arthur Sterling, the fourth-generation helmsman of Sterling Industries, hated the sound. To him, it was the sound of stagnation, of a legacy slowly rusting away while the world bolted ahead on a current of silicon and software. Tonight, the rust felt particularly abrasive. Seated across from him in the plush, burgundy leather booth were two of his executive vice presidents, Gerald Finch and a younger, more odious man named Lawrence Taft. They were celebrating a deal that felt less like a victory and more like a surrender, the proposed $500 million acquisition of Thorne Dynamics. "The board is ecstatic, Arthur," Gerald said, his voice smooth as the age poured in his glass. Gerald had been with Arthur's father. He was part of the furniture, heavy and immovable. "Thorne is the future. This drone technology. It's the quantum leap we've needed." "It's a revolution," Lawrence chimed in, his teeth a little too white, his smile a little too eager. "Marcus Thorne is a visionary. Getting him under the Sterling umbrella is more than a coup. It's an anointment." Arthur swirled the amber liquid in his own glass, the ice clinking like a distant alarm bell. "A visionary who won't allow our engineers a full, unrestricted inspection of his prototype's core mechanics until the deal is signed," he said, his voice a low rumble of dissent. "He calls it protecting his intellectual property. I call it a very expensive pig in a poke." "He's a showman, Arthur. It's part of his brand," Lawrence placated. "The public demonstrations have been flawless. The media loves him. He's the new face of American innovation." Arthur's jaw tightened. He despised the new breed of tech messiahs, men like Marcus Thorne who sold narratives instead of products, who built empires on charisma and venture capital, while his company built tangible things, turbines, engines, machinery that powered the guts of the country. But the guts were getting old, and Thorne's sleek, autonomous drones promised a high-tech circulatory system that could save the Sterling behemoth from obsolescence. He felt the weight of his great-grandfather's portrait staring down at him from the boardroom, its oil-painted eyes full of stern judgment. It was into this thick stew of anxiety and resentment that Clara Keller moved, a ghost in a starched white apron. She was 22, though the exhaustion in her eyes made her seem older. Her uniform, meticulously clean, was a size too big, a hand-me-down from a previous waitress. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple, severe ponytail that emphasized the sharp, intelligent lines of her face. She moved with a quiet, frictionless efficiency, refilling water glasses and clearing plates with such subtlety that she was barely noticeable. But Arthur noticed everything. He had a mechanical mind, a curse that forced him to see the world as a series of interconnected systems. He watched her and saw not just a waitress, but a study in motion. He saw the way she instinctively shifted her weight to compensate for the slight wobble in the table's leg, a flaw no one else had noticed. He saw how her eyes flickered to the rattling vent overhead, her expression one of mild analytical annoyance, as if she were mentally diagnosing the worn-out ball bearings. There was a precision to her, a contained competence that felt profoundly out of place. "Another bottle of the Montrachet, Mr. Sterling?" she asked, her voice soft and neutral, her focus on the empty bottle, not on the men. Arthur waved a hand, the gesture sharp with irritation. "No, bring me a Scotch, Macallan 25, and get these two whatever they want." Gerald and Lawrence, sensing their boss's mood, ordered far more modest single malts. Clara gave a single brief nod and turned to leave. And that's when Arthur decided to amuse himself. The cloying sycophancy of his VPs, the crushing weight of the Thorne deal, the suffocating atmosphere of the restaurant, it all coalesced into a single sharp point of cruel boredom. "Hold on, miss," he called out. Clara stopped and turned, her face a perfect mask of professional deference. "Yes, sir." He leaned forward, a thin, predatory smile touching his lips. It was a smile his boardroom knew well. It was the smile that preceded a termination or a evisceration. Gerald and Lawrence straightened in their seats, sensing sport. "You've been very observant tonight," Arthur began, his voice deceptively pleasant. Quiet, efficient. You have a practical look about you. You look clever. Clara's expression remained unchanged, but her eyes, a deep and startlingly clear shade of gray, held his. I try to be, sir. Good. Then perhaps you can help us with a little business problem. He gestured expansively around the table. You see, my colleagues and I are in a bit of a pickle. We're about to spend $500 million. My family's money, my great-grandfather's money. He paused, letting the weight of the number hang in the air, a casual obscenity in the hushed room. We're buying a company that makes, well, let's call them flying toys, drones. Lawrence let out a low, appreciative chuckle. Gerald simply smiled into his port. This was Arthur in his element, a casual, brutal display of power. So tell me, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried across the nearby tables. From your expert, practical point of view, what should I do? Is it a wise investment, spending a fortune on a box of flying toys? It was a question designed to humiliate. He expected a blush, a stammer, a flustered, I wouldn't know, sir. He expected her to scurry away, properly chastened and reminded of her station. He did not expect the silence that followed. For 3 full seconds, Clara Keller did not move. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to recede, focusing on their table. Her gaze, which had been professionally blank, sharpened into something keen and analytical. The mask of the waitress dissolved, revealing an unnerving intensity. She looked directly at Arthur Sterling, her gray eyes seeming to catalog every micro-expression on his face. When she finally spoke, her voice was still low, but it had a new timbre. It was the sound of cold, hard steel. You mean Thorne Dynamics, she said. It wasn't a question. The smiles on Gerald's and Lawrence's faces didn't just vanish. They were wiped clean, replaced by identical masks of slack-jawed shock. Arthur's own smile froze, feeling suddenly brittle on his lips. A chill, entirely unrelated to the restaurant's air conditioning, traced a path down his spine. The Thorne Dynamics deal was public knowledge, but her tone implied something far deeper than a headline. And you're not buying flying toys, Clara continued, her voice cutting through the expensive air like a diamond blade. You're buying the Etherwing platform. Specifically, you're buying their proprietary gyroscopic stabilization system, which they claim allows for sub-centimeter precision in high-wind environments. Arthur was speechless. The technical specifications were not part of the public press releases. The problem, she said, taking a half step closer to the table, her voice dropping even lower, is that their stabilization system is a direct infringement on the Kellerman inertial theorem, patent numbers 78894 and 512. A patent that was invalidated 2 years ago by a federal court because its core principles were proven to be physically unattainable under standard atmospheric conditions. It works in a vacuum, but not in the real world. She paused, letting the words sink in. Marcus Thorne hasn't invented a revolution, Mr. Sterling. He's built a very convincing, very expensive fraud. The flawless public demonstrations, they're conducted in controlled environments where he can mitigate atmospheric variables. The moment one of your Etherwing drones encounters unexpected turbulence or a sudden drop in barometric pressure, it won't just drift, it will fail, catastrophically. She straightened up, the waitress mask slipping partially back into place, though her eyes remained hard. You're about to spend $500 million on a fleet of machines that are fundamentally, fatally flawed. So my expert, practical advice? Don't. The silence that descended on the table was absolute. It was so profound that Arthur could hear the frantic, panicked thumping of his own heart. Gerald Finch looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. Lawrence Taft was pale, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish. Arthur Sterling, the man whose sharp tongue and ruthless intellect had terrified competitors for 25 years, the titan of industry who was never, ever caught off guard, had been rendered utterly, completely silent by a 22-year-old waitress. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, the only sound was the faint, rattling hum from the air vent above, a sound that Arthur suddenly understood with sickening clarity. It wasn't a worn-out bearing. It was the sound of an empire on the verge of collapse. Lawrence Taft, ever the opportunist, was the first to recover. He saw not a crisis, but a chance to defend his boss and regain his footing, his face flushed with indignation. "Now just a minute," he squeaked, his voice an octave higher than usual. "Who in God's name do you think you are? You can't just... You're fired. Manager. Somebody get the manager over here right now." Clara didn't even glance at him. Her gaze remained locked on Arthur, unwavering and intense. It was the look of a scientist who has presented her data and is waiting for her peer to acknowledge the irrefutable conclusion. "Shut up, Lawrence," Arthur whispered. The words were barely audible, but they carried the terrifying weight of a collapsing star. The blood drained from Lawrence's face. Arthur's mind, usually a seamless engine of calculation, was struggling to reboot. He focused his full, formidable attention on the young woman before him. "The Kellerman inertial theorem," he said, his voice raspy. "How do you know that name? That patent number?" "My name is Clara Keller," she said simply, as if that explained everything. It explained nothing. "Would you like me to bring that scotch now, Mr. Sterling?" "No," he snapped, his mind racing. "You didn't just read that in a tech journal. The court case that invalidated that patent was sealed. The records are confidential, part of a sealed settlement. How?" A flicker of something raw and painful crossed her face, a crack in the granite facade. It was there and gone in a heartbeat. "The man who filed the original patent was Elias Kellerman," she said, her voice tight. "The settlement was confidential. His ruin was not." The name meant nothing to him. "Who are you?" Arthur demanded, leaning forward. "Are you a corporate spy? Are you working for a competitor? Is this a shakedown?" "A spy doesn't warn you, Mr. Sterling," Clara said, a hint of weariness in her tone. "A spy lets you walk off the cliff and then sells pictures of the wreckage. This is a courtesy. A courtesy that just cost you your job," Gerald finally managed to say, his voice a shocked murmur. "I'm aware," Clara said. She looked from Gerald to Lawrence and then back to Arthur. "I also just saved your company from an acquisition that would have not only cost you $500 million in capital, but would have made Sterling Industries a laughingstock when the fraud was inevitably exposed. The damage to your reputation would have been incalculable." She placed the small black bill folder on the edge of the table. "My shift is over. Your meal has been taken care of by the house. I informed the manager there was a disturbance at this table. Good night, gentlemen." She turned and began to walk away, her back straight, her stride measured. "Wait," Arthur barked. The command cracked through the restaurant's decorum like a whip. Clara stopped, her shoulders tensing, but she did not turn around. "You're right," Arthur said, his voice changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a cold, deadly curiosity. "My team, they were too eager. They saw the show, not the machinery." He shot a venomous glare at Gerald and Lawrence, who flinched as if physically struck. "Get out," he said to them. "Arthur, Gerald began. "Get out. Both of you. Go back to the office. Start drafting the withdrawal statement for the Thorn acquisition. Cite failure of due diligence. And Lawrence," he added, his voice dropping to an icy whisper, "clean out your desk. You're done. Gerald, you have until morning to convince me why you shouldn't be." White-faced and shaking, the two executives scrambled from the booth, leaving a trail of stunned silence in their wake. The dining room was now filled with the furtive glances of patrons pretending not to watch the unfolding drama. Arthur Sterling was alone at his table. Clara Keller was a silhouette against the restaurant's gilded doors. "You're not a waitress," he stated. "Tonight I was," she said, her voice carrying back to him, laced with a profound exhaustion. "I live at the Pierre," Arthur said. "Penthouse suite. Be there tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. "I'm not looking for a job, Mr. Sterling." "I'm not offering you a job, Miss Keller," he retorted. "I'm offering you an explanation. You have knowledge you shouldn't have, and you just detonated a bomb in the middle of my life. You don't get to just walk away from the blast crater. 8 a.m. I'm going to find out who you are." He watched as she pushed through the heavy doors and disappeared into the New York night. Arthur sat alone, the celebratory dinner in ruins around him. He pulled out his phone, not to check his company's stock, but to dial his head of security, a former MI6 agent named Graves, who was as quiet and efficient as a guillotine. Graves, Arthur said when the man answered. I have a name, Clara Keller, and another one, Elias Kellerman. I want to know everything they are and everything they ever were. I want it by sunrise. Arthur did not sleep. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, the city lights sprawling below him like a diamond-dusted circuit board. He didn't see the beauty, he saw a complex, unforgiving system, and he had just been reminded of how easily a single, overlooked component could cause a system-wide failure. At 5:12 a.m., a secured file appeared on his tablet. The sender was Graves. The subject line was simply Keller, C, Kellerman, E. He opened it. The story that unfolded was not one of corporate espionage, but of quiet, devastating tragedy. Elias Kellerman, a brilliant, self-taught mechanical engineer, a savant with gears and gyroscopes. He had run a small, independent R&D workshop in Queens, filing dozens of minor patents over the years. Then came his masterwork, a revolutionary inertial navigation system. He had taken on a young, charismatic business partner to help him market it, a man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne had convinced Kellerman to sign over majority control of the patents in exchange for a promise of funding that never fully materialized. Thorne, using his charm and Kellerman's genius, secured a round of venture capital. Then he systematically locked Kellerman out of his own company, claiming Elias's methods were outdated. He took the core concepts of Kellerman's work, repackaged them under the Thorne Dynamics brand, and launched himself into the tech stratosphere. Elias Kellerman had sued. He'd poured every cent he had into a legal battle he couldn't win against Thorne's army of corporate lawyers. The court case hinged on highly technical data. Thorne's team produced falsified lab results, while Kellerman's key evidence, his original notebooks, were mysteriously lost in a workshop fire that was ruled an accident. The court invalidated Kellerman's patent based on Thorne's fraudulent data, and the judge sealed the proceedings to protect Thorne's proprietary trade secrets. Elias Kellerman was left with nothing. Bankrupt and broken-hearted, his health failed. A year later, he was dead from a massive coronary. He left behind a wife with mounting medical bills from a chronic illness and a daughter, Clara, who had just been forced to drop out of her engineering program at Caltech to support her family. The file on Clara was painfully thin, a string of low-wage jobs, waitressing, tutoring, data entry. Her last known address was a small, rented apartment in a rundown part of Brooklyn, an address she shared with her mother and two younger siblings. Graves had included a final, chilling note. The Kellerman family was 3 months behind on mortgage payments for their small house. Foreclosure was imminent. This wasn't a shakedown. It was a cry of desperation from a young woman who had watched a predator devour her family and was now trying to stop him from doing it to someone else. At 7:59 a.m., the intercom buzzed. Mr. Sterling, a Miss Keller is here to see you. Send her up, Robert, Arthur said. When Clara walked in, she looked smaller and more vulnerable than she had in the restaurant. The waitress uniform was gone, replaced by a threadbare but clean gray sweater and dark jeans. She looked exhausted, her face pale, the dark circles under her eyes telling a story of sleepless nights. She held a worn leather satchel clutched to her chest like a shield. You came, Arthur said, gesturing to a stark white armchair. She remained standing by the door. You have a very thorough head of security, she said, her voice tight. Mr. Graves paid a visit to my landlord this morning. He also spoke to the bank that holds my family's mortgage. There was a quiet accusation in her tone. Graves is efficient, Arthur said, unapologetic. He confirmed your story. I read the court files. The real ones, not the public record. Graves has a talent for acquiring things. He paused. I'm sorry about your father. The words, though sincere, seemed to bounce off her. Are we done? She asked. You have your confirmation. You're pulling out of the deal. I've done what I came to do. We're just beginning, Arthur said, walking to stand before the vast window. I spent the night reviewing my own team's due diligence on Thorne. It was pathetic. They accepted his data at face value. They were seduced by the marketing, by the glamour of it all. They never once thought to question the fundamental physics. He turned to face her. You didn't just save me $500 million, Miss Keller. You saved my company from the kind of humiliation it might never have recovered from. You saved my family's name. That has a value far greater than money. I don't want your money, Mr. Sterling, she said, a flash of her father's pride in her eyes. I know, he said. That's why this conversation is so interesting. He walked over to a massive mahogany desk. I have two offers for you. The first is simple. I will create a trust. It will be substantial enough to pay off your family's debts, cover your mother's medical care for life, and fund the education of you and your siblings through to any doctorate program you choose. You can go back to Caltech. You can have your life back. All you have to do is sign a non-disclosure agreement and walk away. We never have to speak again. He let the offer settle in the room. It was freedom. An end to the constant grinding worry that had clearly defined her entire adult life. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the desperate yearning for that simple escape. And the second offer, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Arthur leaned against the desk, his expression hardening. The second offer is more complicated. I'm not a good man, Miss Keller. I'm a practical man. Marcus Thorne tried to defraud me. He tried to make a fool of me. I don't forgive such transgressions. Pulling out of the deal is no longer enough. Stopping him from acquiring my company isn't enough. I want to destroy him. I want to dismantle his company, expose his fraud to the world, and leave him as bankrupt and broken as he left your father. He looked at her, his eyes cold and clear. You have the one thing my army of engineers and lawyers doesn't have. You have the truth. You understand Thorne's fraud at a granular, fundamental level because your father was its first victim. You know where the bodies are buried because you watched him dig the graves? He pushed off the desk and walked toward her. So here is offer number 2. You don't go back to Caltech. You come to work for me, not as an employee, as a partner on a singular project, the systematic destruction of Marcus Thorne. You will be given a lab, a team, and the full unlimited resources of Sterling Industries. You will have access to Graves. You will have access to me. We will not just prove his technology is a failure. We will prove it was a deliberate, calculated fraud from its inception. We will find every corner he cut, every lie he told, every dollar he misappropriated. And when we have enough evidence to bury him, we won't just go to the authorities. We'll go public. We'll orchestrate a collapse so total, so spectacular, that the name Thorne will become a cautionary tale for generations. He stopped a few feet from her. Offer 1 gives you your past back. It gives you peace. Offer 2, he gave a slight grim smile. Offer 2 gives you justice. The kind of justice the courts couldn't give your father. It won't be clean and it won't be pleasant, but it will be absolute. Clara stood frozen, the worn satchel clutched to her chest. He could see the war raging within her. The sensible, tired part of her screamed to take the trust, to run back to the safety of a normal life. But he could also see a flicker in the depths of her gray eyes, a spark of inherited fire, the ghost of a brilliant man who had been cheated of his legacy. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the satchel to the floor. She unzipped it and pulled out a thick, leather-bound notebook. The edges were singed, the cover stained with soot. She opened it and held it out to him. The pages were filled with intricate hand-drawn schematics, elegant equations, and notes written in a precise, meticulous script. They were beautiful, the work of a master. It was her father's last remaining notebook, the one he must have had with him on the day of the fire. He didn't just steal my father's work, she said, her voice trembling with a fury that had been suppressed for years. He perverted it. My father's designs were for a search and rescue drone. It was meant to find people lost in the wilderness, to deliver medical supplies in disasters. It was meant to save lives. She looked up at Arthur, and for the first time, he saw not a victim, but a weapon waiting to be aimed. Marcus Thorne turned it into a toy for corporate vanity. He made it cheap. He made it flawed. He made it a lie. She closed the notebook with a soft, final snap. I don't want peace, Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice clear and hard as a diamond. I want to burn him to the ground. Arthur Sterling smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who had just acquired the most valuable asset in the world, A motivated genius with nothing left to lose. Good, he said. Let's get to work. The war against Marcus Thorne was not fought in a boardroom. It was waged in a place Arthur hadn't set foot in for 20 years. The old Sterling Industries R&D prototyping lab. It was a cavernous space smelling of ozone, hot metal, and forgotten ambition. Dust-sheeted relics of past projects stood like ghosts. Failed engines, experimental turbines, monuments to ideas that had cost millions and gone nowhere. Arthur had it cleared, cleaned, and retrofitted in 48 hours. This was Clara's kingdom. Arthur assigned her a team of 3 of his best and most curmudgeonly senior engineers. Men in their late 60s, lifers at Sterling who had forgotten more about mechanical engineering than Lawrence Taft had ever known. Their names were Hal, Ben, and a silent, scowling man named Abe. They viewed Clara with undisguised skepticism. To them, she was a child, a waitress their boss had inexplicably hired, a distraction from their real work. The first day was a stalemate of icy politeness. They called her ma'am with a tone that clearly meant girly. They listened to her initial briefing, their faces impassive masks of professional tolerance. Clara knew she couldn't command their respect. She had to earn it. On the second day, she didn't talk about Thorne. Instead, she walked over to a dusty corner of the lab where the skeletal frame of the Sterling S-12, a failed rotary engine from the 1980s, sat in disgrace. It was a legendary failure, a project that had nearly bankrupted Arthur's father. The harmonic dampener on this was miscalibrated, she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. Hal, the lead engineer, scoffed. We spent 5 years and $40 million trying to fix the vibrations on that thing, ma'am. It was a design flaw from the block up. It wasn't a design flaw, Clara said, running a hand over the cold metal. It was a materials flaw. You were using a nickel-steel alloy for the crankshaft, standard for the time, but the asymmetrical rotor design created a secondary resonance frequency that the alloy couldn't absorb. It amplified it. She looked at Abe, the silent one, who was watching her with a new intensity. You needed a tungsten counterweight, but not a solid one. A powdered tungsten suspension in a viscoelastic polymer housing. It would have absorbed the secondary vibrations without compromising the primary balance. Abe's jaw dropped. Hal and Ben exchanged a look of disbelief. How in the hell would you know that? Ben demanded. That theory, using polymer suspended weights, that wasn't even published until the late 90s. My father was working on it in '85, Clara said quietly. He called it dynamic fluid balancing. He just never had the money to build a prototype. She looked at the 3 men, her gaze steady. I am not a manager. I am not your boss. I am an engineer, and I need your help to dissect another bad design. From that moment on, they were her team. The ma'am disappeared, replaced by Clara. They brought her coffee. They argued with her about fluid dynamics and tensile strength. They became her loyal, grizzled army. With the team behind her, Clara began her deconstruction of Thorne dynamics. It was a masterpiece of forensic engineering. They didn't just look at Thorne's public data. They set out to replicate his supposed results from the ground up, using her father's notebook as their Bible. They built their own drone in the lab based on Elias Kellerman's original, untainted schematics. It was not as sleek or as pretty as Thorne's Etherwing, but it was a work of rugged genius. While Thorne's drone was a hollow plastic shell, theirs was a sturdy carbon fiber frame. While Thorne used cheap, off-the-shelf processors, Clara had the team machine build a custom housing for the guidance system, insulating it from electronic interference. Meanwhile, Arthur and Graves waged war on a different front. Graves, with his unique and persuasive methods, acquired one of Thorne's flawless Etherwing drones from a disgruntled supplier. They brought it back to the lab, and Clara and her team descended on it like wolves. The teardown was a revelation. It was worse than she had imagined. He's using unshielded wiring, Ben muttered, pointing with a pair of pliers. A strong magnetic field would throw the gyros into chaos. The servo motors are consumer grade, Hal added, disgusted. They're from a hobbyist catalog. They'll burn out after 100 hours of use, tops. But the fatal flaw, the smoking gun, was exactly where Clara knew it would be, the stabilization system. Thorne hadn't even tried to solve the problem articulated in her father's patent. He'd simply ignored it and used a software patch to mask the instability. It was a digital bandage on a mortal wound. "It's a lie held together by code," Clara said, her voice filled with a cold fury. "In stable conditions, the software can compensate, but if you give it too many chaotic inputs at once, it's like a person trying to balance on one leg," Abe said, speaking for the first time in days. "If the wind blows and someone shoves them at the same time, they go down. The software will crash." "So we need a storm," Arthur said, a predatory glint in his eye. He had been observing their work daily, a silent partner in their quest. "We need to create the perfect storm." The plan was audacious. Arthur didn't withdraw his acquisition offer. Instead, he did the opposite. He publicly praised Marcus Thorne, calling him a true partner in innovation. He announced that to celebrate their new venture, Sterling Industries would host an unprecedented live demonstration of the Etherwing's capabilities. He invited not just his board, but the biggest names in tech. The cavernous, climate-controlled space of the Sterling Aerospace facility felt less like a hangar and more like a cathedral dedicated to a false god. Marcus Thorne was its high priest, radiant in a suit that cost more than a year of Clara's old salary. His charisma, an intoxicating incense that filled the air. He moved through the crowd of investors, journalists, and Pentagon officials with the effortless grace of a predator who knows he owns the forest. Arthur Sterling, standing aside, played his part to perfection. The elder statesman, the patron, the old money bull graciously allowing a younger, sleeker matador to command the ring. He felt the phantom weight of his great-grandfather's portrait on his shoulders, its stern eyes not judging him now, but watching, waiting for the killing blow. Clara stood in the periphery with her three grizzled knights, Hal, Ben, and Abe. To the world, they were anonymous engineers. To Arthur, they were the fates, waiting by the loom. When Thorne was introduced to her, his eyes, so practiced at assessing value and status, registered nothing. He saw a lab coat, a severe ponytail, a junior engineering consultant. He saw a ghost. He gave her a smile that was all teeth and condescension. "Always great to see some new blood. Don't let these old gearheads scare you off." He turned his back, dismissing her from his reality, already focused on a fawning reporter from the Wall Street Journal. The insult was so casual, so complete, that it didn't sting. It solidified. It turned the simmering fury in Clara's veins to ice. She met Hal's gaze across the floor and gave a nod so slight it was barely a tremor. The overture was over. The demonstration began as a symphony of deception. Inside the vast, sealed testing chamber, the Etherwing performed its flawless ballet. It navigated a labyrinth of obstacles, its camera feed projected onto massive screens, a testament to stability and precision. The crowd was a chorus of appreciative murmurs. Thorne at the podium was the triumphant conductor, soaking in the adulation. "And now," his voice boomed, rich with manufactured confidence, "for the grand finale, a simulation of the high-wind, final-mile logistics that will not just disrupt, but completely redefine the future of global commerce." The drone ascended, picked up a small Sterling-branded package, and began its flight toward a distant landing platform. Thorne was smiling, but Arthur saw the micro-expressions he had missed before, the slight tension in his jaw, the subtle sheen of sweat on his brow. The showman was a gambler, and this was his final, all-in bet. "Hal," Arthur spoke into his lapel microphone, his voice a flat, dead thing. "Let's change the weather." In the control room, a wry smile touched Hal's lips. He didn't flip a switch. He caressed a series of sliders on a touchscreen. The sequence began. It was insidious. The change was not a storm, but the unsettling feeling of a storm's approach. The powerful, silent fans deep within the hangar walls began to spin, creating a complex, unpredictable crosswind. Atomizers in the ceiling released a fine, clinging mist that was not quite rain, lowering the temperature and raising the humidity. The barometric pressure began a slow, steady fall. These were not hurricane conditions. They were the conditions of a miserable Tuesday in November, the very real-world variables Thorne had spent a fortune to avoid. On the massive screens, the Etherwing flinched. The perfect image wavered, a digital heartbeat skipping. Thorne's smile became a rictus. A minor atmospheric disturbance, he announced, his voice a fraction too loud. The Etherwing's proprietary adaptive software is recalibrating in real time. You are witnessing its genius at work. He's lying, Clara whispered to herself, her eyes locked on the telemetry data streaming to her private tablet. The processor is redlining. It can't solve the equation. Abe, Arthur's voice came through the comms, as cold and hard as a glacier. Give him the shove. From a separate console, Abe, the silent one, activated a series of powerful electromagnets embedded in the hangar floor. They were designed to test avionics against the effects of solar flares. They pulsed, flooding the chamber with an invisible, chaotic magnetic field. For Thorne's unshielded consumer-grade electronics, it was the equivalent of a neurological seizure. The effect was not a simple crash. It was a violent technological death. The drone, its software brain, scrambled by the magnetic pulse, while its physical body was battered by the wind and disoriented by the pressure drop, went berserk. It was no longer a machine. It was a wounded animal. It bucked and spasmed in midair, its rotors screaming at different pitches as the stabilization system failed utterly. The live feed on the screens became a nauseating, strobing vortex of static before blinking to black. The drone, trailing a wisp of blue smoke from a fried circuit board, tumbled from the sky. It did not shatter. It hit the concrete floor with a pathetic, hollow thud, the sound of cheap plastic breaking. A single, unified gasp swept through the hangar, a vacuum of sound that sucked all the air and arrogance out of the room. Thorne's face was a canvas of disbelief and horror. The tan seemed to have evaporated, leaving a pasty gray pallor. A glitch, a technical... One of the rotors must have... His voice cracked, the conductor's baton falling from his nerveless fingers. It was not a malfunction. The voice was clear, calm, and amplified. A single harsh spotlight cut through the gloom, finding Clara as she stepped from the shadows. She held her tablet like a stone tablet of commandments. Every eye in that cathedral of lies turned to her. It was not a malfunction, she repeated, her voice unwavering as it echoed through the vast space. It was a catastrophic design failure, a failure that has been deliberately, systematically, and fraudulently concealed by Marcus Thorne for the past 5 years. The dead screens behind her blazed to life. On the left, a beautiful, intricate schematic, the elegant, balanced gyroscopic system from her father's singed notebook. On the right, a stark, computer-generated rendering of the cheap, flawed components inside the wreckage on the floor. The contrast was damning. Genius versus fraud, integrity versus expedience. The Etherwing stabilization system, Clara announced, her voice ringing with the weight of stolen years, is a perversion of the Kellerman inertial theorem designed by the late Elias Kellerman, a brilliant engineer who was systematically defrauded by his business partner, Mr. Thorne. Thorne stole his intellectual property but lacked the genius to replicate it. So instead, he papered over the fatal flaw you just witnessed with a software patch. A patch that is mathematically guaranteed to fail under the exact multivariable real-world conditions a commercial drone would face every single day. Thorne, his face now a mottled purple, lunged for the podium microphone. This is preposterous. Slander. Who is this? This woman. She's nobody. This is corporate sabotage. Security. But before he could speak another word, Arthur Sterling stepped forward, moving to stand beside Clara. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His presence was a physical force, his authority a gravitational field that bent the room to his will. This, he said, his voice a thunderclap that silenced the rising chaos, is Miss Clara Keller. She is the daughter of Elias Kellerman, and as of this morning, she is the newly appointed president of Sterling Industries' Advanced Robotics and Applied Physics Division. He gestured to the screens. The schematics were replaced by a cascade of documents, each one a nail in Thorne's corporate coffin. Financial records showing payments for substandard parts, supplier invoices from hobbyist catalogs, internal emails acquired through the subtle and persuasive talents of Graves, in which Thorne explicitly ordered his engineers to code around the vibration issue, and bury the negative test data. We have spent the last month, Arthur continued, his eyes sweeping over the stunned faces of his board members, the scribbling journalists, the stone-faced men from the DOD, conducting the due diligence my own team so spectacularly failed to conduct a year ago. The evidence is not merely suggestive, it is irrefutable. Thorne Dynamics is a house of cards, built on a foundation of lies. Mr. Thorne has not only committed fraud against his investors and my company, he has built his entire glittering career on the theft of another man's dream and the subsequent ruin of that man's family. Marcus Thorne finally turned and truly looked at Clara. The recognition that dawned on his face was not gradual. It was a physical blow. He saw her now. Not the waitress from the Gilded Lyre, not the junior consultant. He saw the ghost of Elias Kellerman standing before him in the flesh of his daughter, returned not for vengeance, but for reclamation. His mouth opened, a dry, ragged gasp escaping. The charisma, the charm, the entire carefully constructed edifice of his life dissolved in that moment, leaving only the hollow, terrified fraud beneath. The press, smelling a slaughter, erupted. A tidal wave of shouted questions and flashbulbs crashed over the stage. The anointment had become a public execution. The war, however, had only just begun. The day after the demonstration, Arthur and Clara did not celebrate. They convened in his penthouse, a sterile war room overlooking the city. Graves stood silently by the window, a wraith in a tailored suit. On the large screen where Arthur usually monitored global markets, there was only a single unflattering photo of Marcus Thorne. "He won't surrender," Arthur said, swirling a glass of scotch he had no intention of drinking. "Men like Thorne don't retreat. They double down. They will sue for defamation. They'll try to paint you as a disgruntled, hysterical woman. They will use your past, your family's poverty, everything, to discredit you." "Let them," Clara said. She was exhausted, but a new hard strength had settled deep in her bones. The data is the data. The physics doesn't lie. The courts aren't a laboratory, Clara. They're a theater, and Thorne is a master of theater. Arthur looked at Graves. What is his first move? His legal team filed an emergency injunction this morning to block the release of your internal report, citing theft of trade secrets, Graves reported, his voice devoid of emotion. His PR firm has booked him on 3 major news networks tonight. The narrative they're pushing is hostile takeover by corporate raider using discredited former employee's daughter. Clara felt a flicker of the old fear. It was happening again. The army of lawyers, the twisting of truth, the exact same playbook that had destroyed her father. Arthur saw it in her eyes. He set his glass down with a heavy click. "This is not your father's fight," he said, his voice firm, almost paternal. "He fought them alone. You have me. You have Graves. You have the entire legal and financial weight of Sterling Industries. This is not a battle of truth anymore. It is a battle of resources, and we have more." The weeks that followed were a brutal, grinding war of attrition. Thorne's television appearances were slick performances of wounded indignation. His lawyers filed dozens of motions, bearing them in paperwork. They subpoenaed Clara's academic records, her employment history, her family's financial statements, searching for any hint of weakness. But for every move Thorne made, Arthur had a counter. When Thorne's lawyers tried to depose Clara, Arthur's team tied them in procedural knots for weeks. When Thorne's PR firm planted a story questioning Clara's credentials, Graves discreetly leaked the damning internal emails to a competing journalist, turning the news cycle against Thorne once more. Arthur didn't just defend, he attacked. He funded a class action lawsuit for Thorne's early investors. He initiated a full SEC investigation. He turned his immense power, once used to crush competitors, into a shield for Clara and a battering ram against Thorne. The turning point came during Clara's deposition. For 6 hours, Thorne's lead attorney, a piranha in a $1,000 suit, grilled her. He patronized her, questioned her memory, and attempted to twist her grief for her father into a motive for revenge. "So, Miss Keller," the lawyer sneered, "is it not true that you hold a personal grudge against Mr. Thorne? That this entire elaborate scheme is nothing more than a daughter's misguided attempt to avenge a father who, by all accounts, was a failed businessman? Clara looked not at the lawyer, but at the court stenographer. My father, Elias Kellerman, she said, her voice clear and measured, once told me that good engineering is the art of eliminating variables. You remove every point of potential failure until only the truth of the system remains. My personal feelings are a variable. Mr. Thorne's public image is a variable. Your line of questioning is a variable. She leaned forward slightly. The only thing that is not a variable is that the ether-wing drone will fall out of the sky if the barometric pressure drops while it is in a magnetic field. That is not an opinion. That is a fact. And it is a fact for which I have 2,700 pages of supporting data, which I am more than happy to walk you through, equation by equation. The lawyer had no more questions. The fight went out of them. They had brought opinions and character assassination to a battle of physics. They had lost before they'd begun. Victory was not a sudden explosion of joy, but a slow, quiet sunrise. The news of Thorne's capitulation, a settlement that saw him stripped of his company, his patents, and his reputation, came not in a triumphant phone call, but in a simple email. Clara was in the lab arguing with Ben about the thermal conductivity of a new alloy when she read it. She didn't cheer. She simply closed her laptop, took a deep, shuddering breath, and felt a weight she had carried since she was a teenager finally dissolve. That weekend, she didn't go to the lab. She drove to the small house in Brooklyn, the one that had been a constant source of fear and anxiety. The foreclosure notices a recurring nightmare. She walked into the bank that held the mortgage, the same bank that had refused her father a loan to continue his lawsuit, and paid off the entire balance with a cashier's check from her new sterling salary. The teller who processed the transaction was impassive. But for Clara, the stamped, paid in full on the receipt was a sacred text. She brought it home to her mother. Her mom, whose health had already begun to improve with the new comprehensive medical care Arthur had arranged, looked at the paper and began to weep. They were not tears of joy, but tears of profound, heartbreaking relief. In that small, worn kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 struggles, Clara held her mother and finally allowed herself to grieve, not for what she had lost, but for what her father had never lived to see. The brightest dawn came a month later. She established the Elias Kellerman Engineering Scholarship at Caltech. She endowed it with enough capital to fund 5 full-ride scholarships a year, in perpetuity, for gifted students from impoverished backgrounds. Standing on the campus she'd been forced to leave, no longer a dropout haunted by failure, but a benefactor creating opportunity, she felt her father's legacy not as a burden to be avenged, but as a light to be shared. 6 months after the demonstration, the Keller Innovation Lab was the thrumming, incandescent heart of Sterling Industries. The ghosts of failed engines had been replaced by gleaming prototypes. The dust of stagnation had been swept away by a whirlwind of creation. Hal, Ben, and Abe were her Praetorian Guard, and the team of young, brilliant engineers she'd hired were her disciples. Arthur visited her there, a rare trip down from the corporate Olympus. He found her not in her glass-walled office, but on her hands and knees with Abe, examining the undercarriage of a new prototype. She was wearing oil-stained overalls, her face smudged with grease, and she had never looked more powerful. He leaned against a heavy workbench, a genuine smile touching his lips. "There's a map in the new National Park Service Command Center," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "It's got pins in it. Every pin is a successful rescue mission. 12 of them are blue." He paused. "Blue is the color for missions completed by a Guardian drone." Clara looked up, wiping her hands on a rag. Her face glowed with a kind of satisfaction that could never be found on a balance sheet. "I know," she said. "The director sent me the GPS logs. Abe and I think we can shave another 17 seconds off the deployment time by redesigning the launch clamps." "Your father would be proud," Arthur said. The words felt true and inadequate at the same time. "He would have told us that GPS latency was unacceptable and to build our own damn satellite," she replied, a wry grin spreading across her face. Arthur let out a laugh, a real, unforced sound that echoed in the bustling lab. It was the sound of a man unburdened. He probably would have. He looked around at the controlled chaos, at the whiteboards filled with elegant equations, at the fusion of grizzled veterans and bright-eyed youth. You know, he said, his gaze distant, for 30 years, I've seen this company as a fortress to be defended. My inheritance. I was so focused on protecting the walls, I never realized the foundation was rusting away. I was preserving a legacy. You're building one. Before she could respond, a nervous intern scurried over, holding 2 styrofoam cups. Mr. Sterling, Miss Keller, I brought you coffee. Arthur graciously took one. Clara held up a hand, her analytical gaze shifting to the sputtering office coffee machine in the corner. Paul, she said, her eyes flicking to his name tag. Thank you. But next time you need to descowel the heating element and check the primary gasket on the pressure valve. It's misaligned. We're losing approximately 17% thermal efficiency during the brew cycle. She gave the intern a kind but serious look. It's why the coffee tastes burnt. The intern stared, utterly bewildered. Arthur looked from the young man's stunned face to Clara, who had already turned back to the drone prototype, her mind on to the next problem. He looked down at the mediocre coffee in his hand, and he threw his head back and laughed again, a deep, rolling laugh of pure revelation. She was not a waitress. She was not a corporate savior. She was not the instrument of his revenge. She was an engineer, down to her soul. She was a woman who saw the world as an intricate, flawed system, and she was possessed by a fundamental, unshakable need to fix it, to align the gaskets, to balance the equations, to make things right. And Arthur Sterling, the 4th-generation helmsman of a rusting empire, finally understood. He had not acquired a new technology. He had discovered a new foundation, not of steel or iron, but of an unyielding, brilliant, and ferocious integrity. And upon that foundation, they could build anything.